Good afternoon, everybody. Please take a seat. We're in the final stretch before liberation. Yes, a 4-day retreat that ends in liberation. Okay, so following from this morning's material, we're talking about the Four Noble Truths, and we're up to the truth of suffering and its causes. So this morning we finished off with this particular slide, and we were discussing about defilements, karma, and so forth this morning. So hopefully that helps jog your memory. So in terms of the defilements, where we ended off were the three main roots, the three unwholesome roots of greed, anger, and ignorance. So let us begin by looking at the root of ignorance, which has the meanings of being foolish and, more importantly, lacking in knowledge or proper knowledge, right knowledge. Now, this naming is derived from the lack of understanding concerning the truth. So that's why I said lack of proper knowledge or right knowledge, because ignorance here doesn't mean they don't have any knowledge, but it's referring to ignorance towards the truth, having a lack of understanding about the truth. So the defilement of ignorance, because of the limits of the word, when you're telling people about it, talking to people about it, please remember to stress the defilement of ignorance is not about having no knowledge at all. So it's referring, actually, for most of the time, it means we have knowledge, but it's incorrect knowledge. And it mistakes what is false to be true. So just like a person who is drunk or bewitched, who then mistakes what is real to be unreal, and vice versa, takes what is unreal to be real. Or a drunken person may view things to be existent when actually that thing is not there, and so forth. So, as you know, with many drunken people, depending on what they perceive, they may end up laughing, crying, and they do things that they normally wouldn't do when they are sober. So that's what ignorance does to us. Because it leads us to misunderstand things, we therefore act according to that misunderstanding and do many things that if we had wisdom, if we were sober with wisdom, we wouldn't do. So other words that come about relating to ignorance is confused, deluded, doubtful. These are all manifestations of ignorance. So because we have ignorance, we don't understand the truth. We do go about our lives in a confused manner, deluded manner, and often we doubt, and we even doubt the truth itself. And this is the hardest defilement to remedy or to uproot. And concerning what ignorance does not know, this includes not knowing about what is wholesome and unwholesome, not knowing about cause and effect, not knowing about karma and its results, and not knowing about the existence of ordinary beings and sages, and not knowing the truth of things. So this aspect about not knowing about the existence of ordinary beings and sages implies not knowing that there is the possibility to progress to enlightenment. Now, in terms of views and understandings that ignorance generates, these are namely believing in what is impermanent to be permanent, or mistaking what is suffering to be happy and enjoyable, taking what is impure to be pure, and mistaking what is effectively empty to actually have an intrinsic self. So essentially, ignorance causes us to have doubts about the truth and or to have incorrect views about the truth. Now, the second defilement is the root of anger, which is an ill will that arises when one is dissatisfied with the environment or the object that they encounter. Now, if this ill will is projected externally, it can manifest in the form of rage, conflict, harm, enraging others, and so forth. And when this ill will is harbored internally in our minds, it can develop into the mental activities of indignation, hatred, jealousy, envy, and so forth. Now, these kind of unwholesome actions and mental activities are very serious. Not only do they cause us to commit many unwholesome deeds, but even towards good deeds, they actually lead us to have the thoughts of destruction, all because of an instance of intolerability. So what this means is this particular root of anger, for many people, it may not arise that obviously, but when it does arise, it can, often the simile of a fire is used. It can burn away all of our wholesome roots and intentions. So the kindest person, you know, if you think about working for charity, everybody is there with good intentions, but when, you know, conflicts arise and heated debates and all that come up, you can then destroy that whole harmony when everyone intentionally came to do good, but because of conflicts internally, that anger, that element of anger, ill will arises, and it can destroy what was or what should have been a wholesome event and activity. So from the past to the present, we have always had a very close interrelationship with other sentient beings. And therefore, we actually should have a mind, or we should cultivate a mind of compassion. That is, a mind that has no intention to harm. And only then can we benefit ourselves without harming others' benefits, as well as realizing mutual harmony and mutual benefit. But sadly, the defilement of anger yields the opposite result, and it is the origin for unwholesome behavior that can become very extreme. So the sutras say, with a single thought of anger, 80,000 gates of obstructions open. And it also says, anger is like fire that burns all forms of wholesomeness. Okay, so this defilement of anger is very serious. Now, the third is the root of greed, which refers to attachment to oneself and everything that relates to us, including dwelling on the past, immersing ourselves in the present, and our hopes for the future as well. So greed here is referring to a deep attachment to oneself, which persists from the present into the future. And in relation to other people, it's an attachment to things like our parents, our children, our siblings, our friends, and so on. So the key here is our or my, that attachment. And in relation to matters and other objects and things, it's an attachment to my wealth my career, my education, my reputation, and so forth. Okay? So the key here again, it's my. It belongs to me. So the defilement, even though the defilement of greed is not considered as serious as the fire of anger, nonetheless, it is like water that can slowly seep away deep down into everything. And when everything gets soaked and immersed with this defilement of greed, a lot of unwholesome actions will then start to arise. So greed, as the previous description says, is very deep rooted. So if you think about water, it's water generally is not as harmful as fire, unless you're thinking of like the great floods, the storms and so forth. But water just sitting there is relatively harmless, but it can slowly seep down into everything. And that's greed. If we're not careful about it, we can be on guard. As practitioners, we can be on guard. But if we're not careful and not mindful to constantly check, at times, elements of greed disguised in other forms can start to seep into various parts of our lives and behaviors. So with the presence of this mental factor of greed, though one can accomplish many good deeds, but due to having that self-attachment as the foundation, the results cannot be considered as purely wholesome. And at times, things can take a turn for the worse. And because of that, the greed can then lead to anger, which then leads to a whole lot of other trouble happening. So in this sense, it's very important to watch out for these major defilements. And sometimes at the very extreme, love can turn into extreme hatred as well. Because there is love, there is anger and hatred. Because love and anger, if we think about it, are virtually inseparable, like the two faces of a coin. And according to the Buddha Dharma, this is the true face of ordinary beings, of unenlightened beings. Moreover, when there is attachment, one attaches to everything. So every change affects our mental activity and leads to pain and suffering. Therefore, the Buddha teaches that when attachment arises, then suffering arises. So the classification of defilements into the three major categories of greed, anger, and ignorance can be said to be specific to the desire realm. And in particular, these categories relate to human beings. In relation to the form and formless realms, the defilement of anger is not active. So if you remember when we were talking about unmoving karma, the beings there are immersed in meditative concentration. Okay, so this next verse lets us understand a different set of classification which relates to the whole of the three realms. And it says, Buddha taught about all defilements. He used views, attachment, arrogance, and ignorance. Due to the attachment to the view of I and mine, beings cycle from death and birth endlessly. So when the Buddha taught about all the defilements that relate to all sentient beings in the three realms, he used a different set. And this set has 4 categories. And they are the categories of views, attachment, arrogance, and ignorance. So these categories can be approached using various meanings, and hence there are different explanations, which we will now look at 3. So the first meaning is what the ancient masters call the four neutral moral roots. Now, these defilements are very weak, but nonetheless, they are defilements, and so they're classed as obstructing neutral defilements. When defilements were carefully analysed in detail, these four defilements were discovered. In particular, the teachings of the Mahayana Yogacara school, or also known as the consciousness-only school, regard these four as defilements that correspond to the seventh consciousness. Now, until one has attained the level of a sage, that means one has attained some awakening to the truth at the minimum, and therefore have cut off some defilements, these four neutral moral roots remain deep-seated and are the unique internal defilements found in sentient beings. Under this meaning, these four are called self-ignorance, self-view, self-arrogance, and self-attachment. Okay? So this concept of self-ignorance, self-view, self-arrogance, and self-attachment is very strongly emphasized in the Yogacara teaching. So if you want to understand that a bit more, I would suggest you have a look at the Yogacara teachings and the function of the seventh consciousness. So here, self-ignorance refers to holding on to or believing in the notion that an intrinsic self exists when essentially there is no intrinsic self. Now, due to this mistaken notion that an intrinsic self exists, there arises an attachment to it, and this is called self-view. Now, on account of having attachment to the notion of an intrinsic self, beings develop a sense of superiority concerning the self, and this is then called self-arrogance. And not only do beings develop a sense of superiority, but they also crave and attach to the self, and this is called self-attachment. So all the activities undertaken by sentient beings that revolve around themselves all stem from these four inner defilements that are unique to sentient beings. Now, the second meaning is based on a categorization commonly seen in the Agama Sutras. And in terms of humankind, the errors arising from defilements can be divided into two main groups. So the first group is the error in terms of cognition, which is called views. Now, this error can be remedied when we acquire correct understanding and firm awakening. The other group is the error in terms of behavior, which is called attachment. And this type of error can only be remedied with right views and mindfulness in one's daily life by attending to one's behaviors constantly and applying repeated practice. So this is why some people say that knowing is easy, but doing is hard. Okay, so in a lot of the texts that you read, there's a difference between having understanding and then affecting that knowledge into your very being. So as Faye always uses the example of her temper, you know, being a Buddhist and having learned about the vices of having a bad temper, knowing about it is not enough to get rid of it. Knowing about it is the first step, and then learning about the practices to tackle that situation. How do we temper ourselves? How do we defeat our defilement of anger and temper? That all comes with practice. So this is another categorization of views and attachments. Now, on the path from an ordinary person to becoming a sage, when one cuts off some of their defilements but has yet to end all defilements, their situation is regarded as having remnant arrogance. Now, arrogance here refers to a very subtle notion of intrinsic self, which is the cause leading to all sorts of behaviors that revolve around the self. When this arrogance is completely cut off, one attains the state of liberation. However, for the arahats, they still have residual defilements. Here, residual defilements refer to subtle forms of ignorance, also known as ignorance without attachment. If the arahats can end these remnant defilements, then they have attained absolute or the utmost purity. Okay, so there's a bit of difference. There's subtle arrogance, which means they haven't fully cut off the attachment to an intrinsic self. And then there are remnant defilements, which here refers to very minor defilements, but they're so subtle that they're, again, not strong enough to bring on future cyclic births and deaths and so forth. And examples of this is in the teachings, the exegesis by Nagarjuna, he did give some examples and compare them. So one was that when the Buddha was giving a teaching and you had the great disciples there, a bird flew by and was very happily, in the presence of the Buddha, flipping its wings and jumping about around the Buddha. But as that bird passed by the shadow of Shariputra, it was still, that little bird still had a bit of fear. So unlike when the bird, was flying in front of the Buddha, flying past the Buddha's shadow, or even landing on the Buddha, that bird had no sense of fear. It felt absolutely safe because of the purity of the Buddha. But Shariputra, although already an arahat, his personality, his personal characteristic was inclined to anger in the past. So there are stories of his past lives where, he was a snake and he bit a prince, and the doctor or the witch doctor, whatever you may think of, said to the viper, "You better suck out that poison or we'll throw you in the fire." And, what does Sariputta says? "What I've spat out, I'll never take back." And he jumped himself in the fire. So that was a way to express the anger personality of Shariputra in the past. So at the time that, Shariputra is now the Buddha's disciple and an arahat, enlightened, he has cut off all forms of arrogance, but he still had some subtle remnant defilements, and that comes from his anger. And that's why when the bird just flying past into his shadow, was still a bit apprehensive, unlike the Buddha. So there are stories like that to try and indicate what does it mean by having remnant defilements. They're not strong enough to keep the person in cyclic existence, but they're still there, and they're not as pure in that sense if compared to a Buddha that has cut off absolutely everything. Now, the third meaning regards ignorance as the basis of all defilements, and stemming from ignorance are the errors of understanding, emotions and intentions, and all these errors fall under views. attachments and arrogance, respectively. So all defilements can be classed under these categories. Each defilement has the function of creating karma and nurturing karmic forces, which means that they have the power to create cyclic existence. And among all forms of defilements, which one is the most fundamental? The teachings on the Four Noble Truths. In the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, attachment is said to be the fundamental defilement, because attachment is a craving, a very strong clinging that is the basis of suffering. However, in other sutras, you will also see the teachings say that ignorance is the most fundamental, and namely the view of a self and that which belongs to the self. So this can be explained with an analogy. When someone is stuck in a thorny bush and their eyes are blindfolded, they will struggle to get out of that bush. So the blindfold represents the defilement of ignorance, while the obstructions of the thorny bush can represent attachment. Therefore, some sutras say that ignorance and attachment are like the parents of cyclic existence. But in this situation of the thorny bush, if one wants to get out, then the primary action is to first remove the blindfold. Accordingly, we can understand this analogy as ignorance is the fundamental basis of cyclic existence, and liberation from cyclic existence primarily relies on the power of wisdom. So ignorance, as I mentioned before, does not mean we know nothing. In contrast, one can be full of incorrect understanding. And the key incorrect understanding is not knowing that there is no intrinsic self and that which belongs to the self. So not knowing that there is no I and mine. Because of this incorrect understanding, we actually attach to the notion of a self. We attach to this I, and therefore we then attach to everything that belongs to the self, everything that is mine. Therefore, ignorance refers to not knowing about intrinsic self, and in terms of cognition, it beholds the view that there is an intrinsic I and mind. So the intrinsic I means something that must have total control. Namely, this means one has the ability to make all decisions and to control everything, not only relating to them, but relating to others as well. So when we think about it, even at a very, obvious level, this intrinsic I does not exist. Therefore, the view of an I and mine is centered on oneself, while everything else belongs to that self and becomes what I own, what I know, what I control. So everything should be as I wish it to be. So this is the misunderstanding that we have and the consequence that arises because of that. Now, whether consciously or subconsciously, sentient beings undertake their activities with this view as their basis. Now, this view leads beings to want to control everything within themselves as a central focus. But even, strong dictators throughout history and even the God of the Western theist beliefs are unable to control everything. Instead, the outcome is that sentient beings attach to everything like glue, and this is a very powerful centripetal force. So activities undertaken with this view as the basis creates a force, karma. And these are the forces behind cyclic existence, as well as the manifestation of sentient beings as separate individuals. So in terms of sentient beings as bodies, there has never been an intrinsic self that is permanent and unchanging. Like the Atman or the soul that appears in Indian religions and Western religions. These are what non-Buddhist teachers or non-Buddhist beliefs propose to be the true self. And this so-called Atman or soul is supposed to be permanent and unchanging. But the Buddha teaches us that there is no such Atman, there is no such soul. Rather, sentient beings are merely a compounded existence of the activities relating to the body and mind, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 6 realms, and so forth. Now, it is due to the view of I and mind and attachment to this view that beings develop the mistaken notion of a permanent and independent self. And this is quite easy to understand. When we look at ourselves, in a very honest and open way, sure, we know theoretically that from a baby to infancy, adulthood, and old age, we change. But somehow deep inside, we still think that I am there. And it's that I that we don't go deep enough to investigate. Has that changed? Where is that? But we just somehow assume that that I is there and will be there. Okay? So even as Buddhist, it's obvious we still have this attachment to I and mine because we're not liberated yet. So that's the quickest way to test. When someone say that, they know that there is no I and mine, and they talk about how well they know and how well they're practicing, the quickest way to test is, are you liberated yet? Because if they truly understand it, then yes, they should be liberated. But if they're not, then deep down in their 7th alaya, the 7th consciousness, there's that very, very, very subtle attachment to self-arrogance is still there. And because of this attachment to the view of I and mind, there's that centripetal force that arises and gets stronger and stronger, which then leads to the manifestation of separate individuals. However, such manifestations, again, are also a result of karmic forces, and karmic forces, remember, have their limits. So when they're exhausted, that is, after a certain duration, the karmic force is all spent up, and this leads to the manifestation of death, what we see as death. So note that some people also die due to the exhaustion of their merits or from accidents and so forth. So it may not be because they've exhausted their karmic forces. So if you bring your minds back to when I was presenting on karma, there are, reasons for death. And having a natural death means that all the karmic forces that have come together to give you this particular form of existence has fully been spent, and so death comes, and that's what's considered a natural death. But then there are accidental deaths and so forth that occur prior to the natural death as well. So the fundamental defilement, based on the view of I and mine, continues to exert a centripetal force that aggregates things. It's an aggregating force as well. And this is why a new set of karmic force then ripens and will manifest as a new life, the next life. And then the cycle continues on. So sentient beings are just as such, undergoing death and then birth, and then after birth, one moves towards death again. And this continues endlessly and becomes what we refer to as the cycle of birth and death. So far, we have looked at defilements in some detail now. Now, this next verse moves the discussion to the law of dependent co-arising, which is still under the noble truth of the cause of suffering. And the verse says, "Suffering and its causes are mutually entangled. Death and life arise from conditions. Buddha's teaching on the 12 links uses the analogies of a city and fruit tree." So dependent co-arising explains the cause of suffering from a sequential aspect. So I hope that rings a bell from Venerable Tangce's teachings. So hopefully this material should be a bit of a review for you, and we'll try and go through this a lot faster. So it should be known that suffering does not only arise from causes, but suffering itself can become a cause. So if you think back to that circle, that triangular section, so suffering then leads to ignorance, ignorance leads to actions, actions lead to suffering. So suffering is both a result, but can also be a cause. So for example, when sentient beings' karma result in a new life, with the body and mind that arises from these karmic forces, that body and mind, this new life, then undertakes new activities. And based on the defilements, that new body, that new life, starts to create more karma. And therefore, suffering and the causes of suffering mutually attract and entangle each other and take on the role of both cause and result. So when this aspect is clarified and understood, then one should be able to pick out a key point concerning this notion. One should know that life and death arises from causes and conditions. So in turn, when we think about, dependent co-arising, the key meaning here behind the teaching is that everything exists in reliance or independence on causes and conditions. And in turn, those causes and conditions also rely on causes and conditions to exist. Therefore, each existent phenomenon is a result when we investigate its past, because it arose from causes and conditions. But when we view that same phenomenon from the present and into the future, that phenomenon has an influential force that can affect the future. And in this respect, it takes the function of a cause. So this is how the same thing can act as both a result and a cause. Now, based on this view and understanding of causes and results, the theory of creation by a superpower in theistic beliefs cannot be supported. And the reason is that everything would arise from that superpower, but that superpower itself exists without any causes, or arises without any causes. So in that case, this law of dependent co-arising would fail. So this is one way in which the Buddha refutes the idea of a creator God. And this kind of creator, who is the cause for everything and yet themselves arise from no cause at all, is not realistic. And so this is merely an imagination or a misunderstanding that arises from people due to their ignorance. Therefore, the Buddha teaches that life and death has no beginning. So, I'll just quickly touch on this because you would have looked at it in quite some detail. When we talk about dependent co-arising, hopefully, when people ask you, well, what does it mainly refer to? the thing that comes to your mind are the 12 links. If you want to explain dependent co-arising in relation to human beings and how we get caught in this cyclic existence, you can tell people about the 12 links. And remember, the 12 links can be succinctly grouped into the 3 links of defilement, karma, and suffering. Or you can then further expand it into the 5 links, the 10 links, and the 12 links. Okay, so because of time, let me just quickly give you the analogy of the city and the fruit tree. So if we go back to the verse that this relates to, the verse mentions the city and the fruit tree. And I'll just quickly talk to you about that, and then I'll open the floor for final questions before we all are liberated. So dependent co-arising, cause and results, and so forth. The sutras bring out the analogy of a city. And here, sentient beings are in the midst of the causes and results of the 12 links. Just like being in a city enclosed by city walls, and there's no way out. And that whole city wall surrounds the whole city, and there is only one single gate for exit. Now, this gate is heavily guarded, and so generally most people cannot pass through the gate freely. Now, in the cycle of life and death, although sentient beings have the potential to gain liberation, due to being tied up by defilements, beings have yet to break free from those shackles of dependent co-arising and attain liberation. The other analogy is that of a fruit tree. Now, this analogy begins from a seed that sprouts and grows. Then there are leaves and flowers and fruits, and then the fruits set seed. So the fruits produced seeds, and these seeds are dropped, and then they then sprout and grow. So though the prior tree is not the same as the subsequent tree, but they have a very close relationship. So our prior life is not the same as this life, but they are closely related. So though the prior tree is not the exact same as the subsequent tree, they have a close relationship. And from this seed to the next, this is how that type of tree continues to exist. Okay? So using this analogy, sometimes this analogy is used to explain dependent co-arising and the continuation of life and death, which is hopefully will help you understand a bit more about we're not the same and yet we're the same. So, you know, an apple tree will produce apple seeds and then a new apple tree, but the fruits are still an apple. Yeah. Okay, so given the time, smack bang on 2:00, I'll end the session here, which is quite good because then next year we can start at this particular verse. So do we have any questions? Any final questions? No? Everyone rushing off to liberation? Okay. So this last part, I'm happy to kind of skip over because the bulk of the material was covered in Venerable Tangtze's talk on dependent co-arising. So that way you didn't miss out on anything if you combine the teachings together. Okay. Let's see. Hopefully, let me check. Okay, no questions on Zoom. Okay, if that's the case, I'd like to say thank you everyone for your time and attention, and Apologies if anything was not explained in a clear enough way and made you even more confused, but hopefully with your own diligence and reflection and contemplation, you'll be able to clear things up if I've muddied the waters for you. But again, thank you everybody for your time and your patience. And hope to see you all again in the future when the conditions come together. Okay.